You do sound good.
Thank you.
Okay, we're recording. I'm ready.
Go for it.
The concept of stages of life is incorporated in many faiths and cultural traditions. And we don't expect a 70-year-old to do what a 20-year-old can do. And of course, it goes the other way around. We don't expect a 20-year-old to be wise and experienced. So today we're going to take a little dive into the 7 domains of retiring. What's this all about? And what's it for? And do we want to? Much of the retiring traditions reflect the realities of the male work experience. We don't really ever retire as mothers. We just kind of move over in some major responsibilities and take on being a grandmother. So our thoughts about retiring often traditionally were about men, because women continued to be homemakers and mothers and grandmothers until they fell off the perch, as it were. But as more women enter the workplace, they are also thinking about retiring. So let's talk about retiring. And in the interest of full disclosure, I'm a retired clinician, but most of our 7 domains listeners know that. So let's jump right into the physical domain, because that's the platform from which retiring decisions is often made. We are at our best physically in our 20s. Our brains are the fastest in our 20s. The muscles are the strongest in our 20s. Our kidneys, liver, bone marrow are less efficient as we age. And it's really the rare elite athlete that competes at the top of their game after their 30s. The combination of fast reflexes and strong lungs and heart and strong muscles and experience leads some to perform well into their 30s, but then injuries and decline in function lead them to retire. And it's very rare for a gymnast to continue to really perform and compete in their late 20s because of injuries largely, even though they have enormous experience. So as we age, we get stiffer in our joints and are more likely to have injuries and slower to recover. And our brains get stiffer. We're able to do cognitive things we used to do, but less able to take on new cognitive tasks like a new computer or like a new electronic health record. I think that those are become increasingly difficult to master quickly as we get into our later years, our 60s and 70s. Now, there are some examples of mandatory retirement out there. Pilots have mandatory retirement age of about 65, and that's up from 60, what it used to be. And air traffic controllers have a mandatory retirement age of 56, with exceptions to go all the way to 61. And foreign service employees at the Department of State usually have to retire at 65, but that's where I think the experience would be really great to have into their 70s. Law enforcement officers, national park rangers, and firefighters, they often have mandatory retirement of age about 57. And in many states, judges cannot run for office or continue their job after the age of 70. And in Oregon, it's 75. Now, there are some other examples. Long distance running, to run ultramarathon takes fitness, but it also takes a point of view to keep going, to put your brain in another place. So some of the best ultramarathon runners, who are often women, are into their late 40s. So there are some things we do better as we get older. And how do wisdom and experience count in terms of the physical domain? And there are some jobs where people never retire. I think of farmers around the world. They rarely have a retirement plan, except their children. They just keep working until they can't work anymore. And they may love what they do, but they don't see any other options. So the physical domain has a big say in when people decide to retire from a particular job. But let's move into the emotional and social domains. And I'm going to bring in my favorite millennial, Chloe, who's also our producer here at the 7 Domains. And we're going to talk about the emotional and social domains of retiring through the lenses of a boomer and a millennial. And welcome, Chloe.
Well, I know
you're here because you're managing my sound. So Chloe has the fast brain to do the electronic parts of our podcasts and the editing part. And I don't think I'd be very good at that. So we're grateful for a fast young brain. Let's talk about the emotional domain. As you're thinking about your own retirement someday, you're a very young person. You're moving toward the peak of your capacities here. Are you thinking about
That's
retirement?
scary. The peak of my capacity.
Your peak capacity. Are you thinking about retiring?
So I don't think about retiring so much as what retirement looks like.
Oh,
Yeah. So I don't sit here and go, oh my gosh, like I wish I was retiring tomorrow. But I do think about often actually about the time I do have left working.
Right.
And what my life would look like once I do reach the retirement age.
So you're really thinking about it in a really structured and intellectual way. You're not thinking emotionally.
I think more financially.
Financially. Okay, that's important.
Dreams cost money. Hobbies cost money. And so I think about kind of what I want to do when I reach retirement age, and will I have the finances to help me, accomplish what I want to accomplish when we get there, or when I get there.
Right. Well, when I was in my 40s, I hadn't ever thought about retiring. There were some days when I was working, we were short, and I was working 100 hours a week, and I would walk in from the parking lot thinking, this is my last day. I can't do this one more day.
At
but
40?
Of course, at 45. But then everything worked out. But it turns out a number of my colleagues died before they turned 65. And my husband and I planned the Alive at 55 plan, meaning we would save enough money that at 55, we could do what we wanted to. So we had a little life and we saved a lot. And at 55, we were still having a great time. So we didn't retire then. But I know what it's like to look around and saying, I really have some things I'd like to retire to. There's some things that I'd always hoped to learn about. What happens if I don't get a chance to do those?
Right.
So many of us who have jobs which are all engaging, and boomers are notorious for kind of being all in on their jobs. And we put so many things off, but sometimes, while we're racing down the razor blade of life, we get cut off from the things that we were hoping to do.
When we think about retirement, I have two stories.
Yeah.
My parents retired, and their thought process and the reason why they wanted to retire differs very much from mine. And I don't know so much that it's generational, but I think it's just kind of the environment that I was brought up in versus the environment and the conditions that they were brought up in. They're immigrants. They came from Vietnam, and we come from a middle class family, right? But they made sure that I had everything I need. I had the education I wanted. I had the career that I wanted. And they very much encouraged me to pick my path and kind of go down the road that's best for me. And so I think that in a way really helps me in, I guess, quote unquote, thinking about retirement, because I don't really resent my job, right? I mean, I think a lot of times when people think about retirement, it ties a lot back to your career. You're retiring essentially from your career, from the job that you've been doing for many decades. A lot of people, unfortunately, don't like their job. Maybe it's not the career choice that they wanted. Maybe it's not even a career. Maybe it's just a job to put food on the table. For me, I'm very lucky in the fact that I don't view my job that way. I actually view it as a career that I really like and I really enjoy. And so when I think about retirement, I don't think about ending a part of my life that was so much job and career focused, right? It's more about working up until that point. What does it look like after, right? Because you talked about retiring too, right? So once I retire from this phase of my life, then what do I have to look forward to next? And a lot of people, unfortunately, don't really have that vision. It's just they kind of live day for day. And when retirement age comes, they're just lucky enough or they feel lucky enough to just not be working anymore.
Exactly.
When you think about retirement, it's not so much the end result, but I think it has a lot to do with how you got to retirement.
I think that's exactly right. And I think it's often in the social domain, there are often social strata or financial burdens that keep people working well beyond the time that they even physically are comfortable doing it. And certainly some people have jobs, and I think of the very difficult jobs in meat packing or in farming, although many farmers work for themselves. But around the world, people might be almost indentured servants to the people that whose land they're using. And they work to help their children. They feel like they have to work to keep their food on the table. And once their kids are launched, then sometimes they have a ability to step back a little. But the majority of people on this planet don't have a retirement plan.
Right.
Except maybe their children are their retirement plan. And with children, families getting smaller, there's nobody to take care of them. So they just have to keep working.
And that's unfortunate because I think, we are fortunate enough to live in a country that even still, like you said, a lot of Americans don't have a retirement plan and they just kind of work to survive.
That's right.
They work to live, essentially. And that's something that I feel like a lot of people that do retire might take for granted, the decades of leading up to retirement, right? And that also includes my parents who sacrificed what they had to sacrifice so that I had a good life. And so there's so much that goes into it. And I think a lot of people, when they think about retirement, it's just the end. I feel like, it's the end of an era.
Well, it's the end of an era, but not the end of your life. There's so many things.
Hopefully not. But like you mentioned in the physical domain, there's a certain age that people retire. And at what point do you say, is that age too young to retire? Is that age too old? Kind of the debate now is that a lot of people are going to still be working and they're going to die before they even reach retirement.
Well, we hope that's not the case. But certainly the retirement age, Social Security used to kick in at 65. And now from my age group, it kicks in at 67. And for your age group, it's going higher and higher. And that's because in general, we are much fitter. The average life expectancy is going up compared to when Social Security was invented in the 1930s. They looked at how long people were expected to live, and people are living longer and they're living more healthy. So they're actually more likely to be able to work. But emotionally, you kind of got the 65 thing in your brain, or younger, maybe for you. And 65 people who are saying, I just want my health. I want to stay strong and be healthy so I can enjoy myself in my retirement. I've heard that 1,000 times. So people are planning to retire to, not retire from.
So currently, a fun fact.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned many times, I'm from Vietnam and a lot of my family's back there. One of my aunts, she's a social worker and she retired at 50 and I didn't know that. And so I would always go visit her, but she just never worked. And so I just assumed that she just stopped working. And so I asked her, I'm like, so did you just quit or like what's going on? And she told me, she's like, well, I'm retired. Like I think she was like 52 when I asked her. So yeah, they retire when they're 50.
But in Asia, often they have a very large population of young people. And so you need to push people out of the way so young people can rise, and they may not have the social safety nets. So the 50-year-old may be taking care of her 70-year-old parents. So there are jobs, but particularly for women, number one, you need to move out of the way. So in a population base that's very young, where the young people need those jobs. And then you need to take care of the elderlies like me. So who's going to take care of me?
Oh. And didn't you say, Curly, I remember you saying that you went on like some sort of test, told you that you were going to live longer than you expected.
Yes. I went to the Northwestern Mutual's insurance company.
I remember you telling me and you're like, uh-oh. And I was, I'm going to live longer.
And they said I was going to live to 97. So you have to plan. Well, that nicely fits us into the financial domain. So I'm going to step away from the emotional and the social domain, and my wonderful producer, Chloe, who is still going to be here, thank God. So Chloe, thanks for joining us and your thoughts about your own family's experience and your thoughts about retiring to things. So thank you for helping us out on that.
You're welcome, Curly.
Retirement plans all over the world in developing countries, they don't have retirement plans. And our children traditionally have been our retirement plans. We quit doing what we were doing, whether it was in the fields or whether it was hunting or whether it was working somewhere. We slowed down in the work of childcare and farming or fishing, and our kids took over. But with smaller families everywhere, this becomes more difficult. I mean, outside of the subsistence world and the business world, long-term employees are often offered a retirement plan, and in fact are incentives to like get off the boat. I mean, retire now. And I want to just talk about Andrew Carnegie because he's personally involved in my retirement plan. And he was a famous industrialist, born in Scotland, dirt poor, came to the United States and started a steel industry. And he said, no man becomes rich unless he enriches others. He retired at about 65, sold his steel company, and he was at the time the wealthiest man in the world. But he spent the rest of his life giving away his money, and many of the most beautiful buildings in small towns around the country were built with money from the Carnegie Foundation, and they're called Carnegie Libraries, and they are gorgeous buildings. And he also realized that the teachers in New York had no retirement plan. He was on the board of trustees at Cornell University, and he realized that teachers earned less than his clerks that worked for him, had no retirement benefits. So he started TIAA, the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association, and TIAA insures almost all of the university professors in the country. So I can retire because Andrew Carnegie retired at 65 and gave over the rest of his life to doing things that he's now remembered for. It was the second half of his life that he became most famous for, his Carnegie Libraries, his endowments, and the amazing things he did that echo into my life. So teachers can afford to retire, and I can afford to retire. But many people don't have a retirement plan through their work, or they haven't been saving, and Social Security isn't enough. And women who have been mothers maybe didn't work outside the workplace, and luckily Social Security allows mothers and wives to participate to get money from their husband's retirement plan if they get divorced. So having something to live on becomes critical if you're going to leave the workforce at 65. Well, as we're thinking about not only the financial domain and how much it might cost to retire, we also have to think about the environmental domain, because the image we have of the retiree is somebody from Minnesota who retires, or from Detroit and who retires from the car industry and packs up and moves to Florida. So many people, if they have the resources, pack up and relocate. They sell a big home, they get a motor home, and they go park it in a park somewhere warm and toasty and hang out with other retirees. So changing environment is a part of what many people do when they retire. They don't just change jobs, they don't just change their income, but they relocate someplace. They move to warmer climates, and they get a rocking chair, which I have to divert here a little bit. It turns out that rocking chairs are not just for babies, but are good for your back, an aging back. People, they actually burn calories. So they had people sit in front of a TV in a nursing home, and they had some in rocking chairs and some in regular chairs. And those that sat in the rocking chairs and rocked while they were watching TV, they were calmer, they were less upset, they had their back felt better, and they did better on the get up and go test, meaning can you get out of a chair and walk 10 feet? So the rocking chair has got a great place in everybody's retirement. Go get one, get two, or maybe get three so you can sit side by side with your buddies and talk and rock. Let's talk a little bit about the intellectual domain when we're thinking about what is retiring or retirement. And with us in the virtual studio is Dr. Peggy Batten. And Dr. Batten is a professor in philosophy at the University of Utah, and she is a university professor, which is just about the biggest honor our university gives to our professors. And she's with us to talk about some of the ethical issue about when you should retire or you shouldn't, or what about universities. So thanks for joining us in the Scope studio, Peggy.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, Dr. Jones, Kirtley, my long-term colleague. And I should say first that I think I'm probably the worst person you could choose to interview because, well, other people have figured out how to retire. I've not done it yet. In fact, I'm 16 years beyond normal retirement age.
But that makes you perfect to talk to about it because you've been thinking about this. Well, how would you define retirement?
So there are a number of different definitions. Most of them have to do with quitting work and then depending on savings or other forms of support for one's livelihood. If you go way back to the early roots, I think you would probably conjecture that it comes from the word retire, meaning pull back or withdraw. Is often used in military uses. You ask your troops to retire from a situation. But I think we might be a little bit at a point where retirement borderlines are not so clear anymore. Especially true for people who are self-employed. When do you actually retire? Is that when you quit doing anything or when you quit doing most of what you were doing? And in a world in which it's much easier to work from home, some of the reasons for retirement, like the difficulties of transporting to an office or a workplace of some sort, might be less telling.
Yeah.
One other thing that often doesn't get discussed very much is a person's capacity to be retired and still flourish. Retirement is quite difficult for some people. They report that they feel useless, unwanted, unadmired, unmoored in a way. And other people flourish in retirement. They tend to be self-motivated. They tend to be more pro-social, less isolated. They may work harder at health maintenance, or they're better at actualizing their own values instead of shrinking back into, I guess you might say, obscurity or isolation. So I think this other feature of when is retirement appropriate, right? What should we expect, is really also about what this person can or cannot do.
As a bioethicist with an interest in medical ethics, are there some occupations that should have a mandatory retirement age? And I think airline pilots, and I know European university policies have retirements in the 65 to 67 age for professors, or I think about surgeons. You know, there are old surgeons and there are bold surgeons, but there are no old, bold surgeons. That's a little ditty from my work. So what do you think about that from a medical ethicist point of view? Are there some situations where we should just tell people you've got to retire at this age?
So we want to think about what the function of mandated age-related retirement policies are. And one virtue of them, if you can call it a virtue, is that it allows people to plan ahead and to have clear expectations about how long they will work in this kind of occupation, at what point they would be expected to, not because of anything about themselves, but because that's the standard policy. Now, the other way of looking at mandates is that they're somehow not age-related and don't set a specified date, as some European universities, you're correct in saying, do, but they're tied to function. So if we think about pilots or surgeons or ballet dancers, or how still able is a person to perform the central functions of this occupation, that means we have to have some kinds of tests. At what point do ballet dancers get too old to perform well? I assume is something discussed among dancers.
We've talked a little bit about the fact that actually air traffic controllers are expected to retire in their late 50s. So if we're thinking about something which may be a sedentary job but requires really fast reflexes, thought processes, and how do we test them in surgeons? I suppose we could set up a virtual studio and have them have to, the way we do with airline pilots, they put them in the trainer, they put them in the simulator, and then they have the plane try to fall out of the sky and see how quickly you respond. But would you have to do this on an annual basis, or would you have to do it every 6 months, knowing that functional decline can be accelerated in some people and not in others? So I think that's a burden probably for an institution. Do you have to wait till people start getting sick, till there are errors made, and then step in?
And that involves social pressures, even if they're not very overt, as well as personal decisions. So I assume that it's not exactly entirely up to you when to retire, but if there's an appearance of slippage, you'll be let know subtly or otherwise. Reviews, now there could be relevant data. So, of course, the medical field keeps track of mistakes.
Oh, yeah.
Question we'd want to ask is, are mistakes more frequently made by older surgeons or by younger ones, or maybe even by bored middle-aged ones?
Yeah, those are great questions.
And that would go for any other occupation that involves good judgment and fast. And, there are sort of legendary stories of athletes who are much older than are normally expected to be at highest performance, but somehow keep going.
Yeah. Well, so are there some professions for which age and time actually is an enhancement of function? And I think in your field, I think of philosophy. I'm sure Socrates was probably, how old was he when he died? Do you know that?
I don't know. We could look it up quickly, but
no, let's not.
He does say in one of the dialogues that, of course, are authored by Plato, but it describes Socrates walking down from Athens to the port in Piraeus, and he talks with his interlocutor, the companion who's with him, about what a relief it is to be not subject to the pressures of sexual appetite. What a relief it is. So we know that he's at least somewhat older. There are physical changes, maybe emotional changes that are relevant.
Well, I'm just going to say he looks old in all the sculptures and carvings of him being surrounded by his students. He looks kind of ancient to me. So I'm just going to say, without any data, that I think that philosophy might be a field in which age, because of its enhancement of judgment and experience, might be a field to keep plugging along in. What do you think about that?
Yeah, they certainly do.
There you go. Well, Dr. Batten, I want to thank you for joining us and helping us think really about what age is versus what is function. And the concept of retiring to or retiring from is really important as we make our personal decisions. And you've helped me think a lot and helped us think about what are the roles of retirement in certain fields. Thanks for joining us, Peggy.
It's a real pleasure to be here, and I get to think about it too.
Well, in the spiritual domain, retirement has been a little bit redefined. It's no longer really an automatic shut-off time when people have to leave. It's often thought of as a voluntary withdrawal from work at an age, if you don't require to be leaving at a certain age, that best suits an individual's abilities. But in ancient traditions, and I'm going to pick, for example, the Hindu tradition, there is a stage of life called Vanaprastha, and I apologize to all those people who might be listening who know how to say that correctly, Vanaprastha. It's the third stage of life. And if you're considered in this faith to live on the average of 100 years, now this was written thousands of years ago. 3,000 years ago. So I don't know who was living 100 years back then, but you don't really have a life until you're 20. But the first stage of life is when you're in your early 20s, and that's when you're a student or you're learning your craft. And then the second stage of life is when you're building a home and children and becoming a master of your craft. And the third stage of life, which is about 60, is the Vanaprastha, which means literally retiring to the forest. And this is the third stage of life, and it represents the stage where you actually give over your household responsibilities to the next generation. You take on an advisory role. You think about your spiritual life and gradually withdraw from the humdrum of the daily world of making money or doing what you used to be doing. You turn that over to the younger generation, and you actually have time to listen to your own heartbeat. So Vanaprastha actually means retiring to the forest. And I'm not saying that people have to retire to the forest to listen to your own heartbeat, but it's a time for introspection. You continue to give back through your wisdom and guidance to the younger generation. But this 3,000-year-old tradition has a very specially named time for the 60 to 80-year-olds when they do retire to the forest. Now they have this fourth stage, which is when you're 80 to 100, when you're supposed to give away everything and take off most of your clothes except for a little bit of rags, and you're supposed to, stand with your bowl and beg for your goods. But I don't want to even talk about that. That's the 80 to 100s, and that's a whole another world right now. So in the concept of the spiritual domain, this is often a time when many people have a chance to explore their spiritual life in more meaning and with more depth. And it's a time when they actually give up a lot of the angers and the fears. Many people find that being 60 to 80 is a time for letting go and being more thoughtful and less judgmental. And there's a 3,000-year-old tradition that informs us that this is the time for us to do that. So on the retirement note, the 7 Domains of Women's Health podcast is going to reframe but not retire. For the past several years, we've taken a topic and explored all 7 domains in one 30-minute podcast. That was enormous fun for me and hopefully good listening for you. My favorites: 7 domains of crying, 7 domains of chocolate, 7 domains of becoming a woman. Check those out if you haven't already. But moving forward, we'll just divide up the 7 domains: physical, emotional, social, intellectual, financial, environmental, and spiritual of an issue into separate, shorter podcasts grouped together under one issue. Take our upcoming one on the 7 domains of caffeine. Let me drink a little coffee here to clear my throat and get rubbed up. Or that 7 domains of stuff, the stuff we collect or that our kids collect. And we're going to be talking about some other great topics. We'll talk about it bit by bit. We can get a deeper dive on some topics, and you can choose. Maybe you just balance your checkbook and you're in a financial mood, and that's the domain you want to focus on for the topic. Maybe you are really busy and you're waiting, you only have 10 minutes while you're picking up your kid, and you want to listen to the physical domain. You can choose. So it's about choosing. There may be one domain for the topic that's just right for you, and you could go back and catch the other ones later. Or if you're on a long walk, you can batch all the domains together, however it works best for you. We hope you like it. I know I will. So thanks everybody for staying with us on the 7 domains of retiring. And I'm going to end with the 7 domains of retiring haiku. We are now retired. We hear our own hearts beating. Do we serve the world? Thanks for listening to us at the 7 Domains of Women's Health, wherever you get your podcasts. I hope you're feeling strong in all of your 7 domains.